Alright, so today I'm going to be talking about Kentucky bourbon. First, I'd like to mention that I'm from Bardstown, Kentucky. It's the bourbon capital of the world, and that's one reason I'm so interested in it. I think this is a relatable topic because the majority of the student body at EKU is from Kentucky. So I think as Kentuckians, we should at least know a little bit about bourbon because it has such a big effect on the state. For example, over 15,000 jobs are from bourbon distilleries alone. So I think that's pretty crazy. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what bourbon is and how it's made, a little bit about history about bourbon, and a little bit about bourbon culture. So first I'm going to answer the question, what exactly is bourbon? So bourbon has federal requirements that are set by the government that make bourbon. And first thing is it has to be at least 51% corn. Most bourbons are actually around 60 to 70% corn, but as a federal law, it has to be at least 51, and that's kind of shown. That's a barrel, by the way, but it's kind of shown in the picture that at least half of the barrel is corn and the other is rye and barley. But other things has to be, or can be no more than 80% alcohol, which is probably a good thing for Kentuckians because they love their bourbon, and that would probably knock them on their feet. It has to be aged in a new charred oak barrel, so that just means that the oak barrel, the insides are going to be burned on the inside. There are no additives for color or flavor, so all the color of the bourbon that you see and the flavor that you taste is all coming from the oak wood and the char inside the barrel, also from yeast that's in the bourbon. And technically there's no age requirement, so as soon as the whiskey hits the bourbon barrel, it's considered bourbon. However, most bourbons are aged around 4 to 8 years, some even longer than that. So how is bourbon made? First step is milling. All this means is that your grains, your corn, your rye, your barley, are going to get ground into a powder and then put into a cooker. Step 2 is cooking. And all this is the grains that you ground up are going to be mixed with Kentucky limestone water into a sweet mash. And mash is just what it's called. It's just all the ingredients mixed together. The limestone water is an important part of the bourbon making process because what will happen is the water in Kentucky runs over natural limestone and it removes the iron out of the water. And this is important because it makes the bourbon taste better, one, and two, it makes it more appeasing to the eye. If there were iron in the water, it would make the whiskey more black instead of amberish color. So that's step 2. Oh, actually, sorry. I think it's really cool that the natural limestone is here in Kentucky because technically bourbon can be made anywhere in the United States. However, due to the natural limestone in Kentucky, 95% of the world's bourbon is made here in Kentucky, so I think that's really cool. Step 3 is fermenting, and that's just fancy words for turning the mash into alcohol. And at the end of the step 3, the alcohol content's only around 6 to 8, so much lower than what bourbon is. So in step 4, you're going to distill it. And all distilling is you're going to cook that mash and the alcohol up at high temperatures, and it's going to rise. The vapors are going to rise, and then they're going to enter the column still through that pipe there. And when it hits the top of the pipe, the vapors are going to naturally descend and cool. And as it's cooled, it's going to turn back into a clear liquid at a much higher alcohol volume. And this is called a white dog. And that's what the final product is before it goes into the barrel. So, next I'm going to hit on a little bit about bourbon history. So, just a quick little story about how bourbon came to be. It's not necessarily true, it's kind of been passed down. But a man by the name of Elijah Craig, which some of you may have heard of before, it's a popular bourbon made by Heaven Hill. He was a farmer and he was a Baptist preacher. He had barrels on his farm that he stored like things like pickles and fish and things like that in. And he had an excess amount of whiskey that he wanted to store, and he didn't want to have pickly, fishy whiskey. So what he did was he burned the inside of the barrel, and then he put his whiskey in there, and over time that became bourbon. Another possible origin. So according to Quinton Lyvers, he was the author of a book I looked into called Bourbon Whiskey, Our Native Spirit. He says, the history of bourbon is the history of America. And what he meant by that is some of our founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, they were distillers at that time. And they were some of the nation's actually highest producers of whiskey. So I think that's cool that they had some kind of influence on what bourbon is today. And also another big part of bourbon history, which some of you are probably familiar with, is Prohibition. What Prohibition was when the government put a stop to all sales, production, consumption of alcohol, which we all know consumption didn't happen. People still consume their alcohol. But according to Susan Reigler in Kentucky Bourbon Country, her book that she wrote, before Prohibition there were about 200 distilleries operating in Kentucky. After Prohibition there were about 61. So Prohibition almost killed the bourbon industry. And by 2001, there were about 10 due to consolidation. So a lot of the smaller distilleries merged into, bigger ones. And up until the 60s, people loved their bourbon. It was pretty much all people drank when it came to alcohol. And then about mid-60s, a lot of people were like, they didn't want to drink their dad's drink or the old folks' drink. So they turned to things more like vodka, gins, rums, and that's what they drank. By the mid-80s, bourbon was at its all-time low. So what had happened was a man named Elmer Lee, he was a distiller. He wanted to introduce something to the industry that would spark demand back up. And this was single barrel, which is something that some of you might have heard of. All this is when a bottling process takes place, they're just going to bottle it straight from a single barrel. And normally in the bourbon production process, many barrels of bourbon are put into a large vat and then they're bottled from there because they want the flavor to be consistent. So having a single barrel signified that it was going to be something unique and limited edition, and people really wanted that, and it was going to be really expensive, high-end. And a man by the name of Booker Noe kind of followed suit, and he came out with something called small batch. Same idea, except it was 3 or 4 barrels of bourbon rather than a single barrel. So that worked, and the bourbon industry is crazy if you haven't noticed right now. Just a fun fact, there are about 4.5 million people in Kentucky. There's about 8.5 barrels of bourbon in Kentucky right now. So each person can have about 1.5 barrels of bourbon if they want. So it's something that authenticity is cool again. People like to know where their foods and drinks are coming from. Bourbon is an all natural process. So from start to finish, it's made from the corn and the grains I showed you earlier, and you know how the process works. It's pretty simple, honestly. All the distilleries across Kentucky pretty much do it the same way. They might vary it slightly, but it's pretty much the same way. So it's something genuine, and it's something that should be appreciated. So that leads me to a quote from Paul Steele. He's in this documentary that I watched, Neat, on Hulu. It's pretty cool if you want to check it out. He talks about how everyone is always busy, and bourbon is something that's meant to be enjoyed. And then he goes on to say, I think bourbon is going against the grain of society and returning to where we all come from. So I just think intrinsically bourbon is a great pause button. To me, that is direly needed in today's current climate. So in conclusion, understanding what bourbon is, how it's made, a little bit about general history, and bourbon culture can help you appreciate Kentucky bourbon whiskey just a little bit more.
Next question.
Alright, so in the beginning you stated that you have to put it into a burn barrel. Why is that?
I don't necessarily know why. It's just federal law. I think part of the reason was it made bourbon unique to the United States. To be considered bourbon, it has to be made in the United States. You got your scotches, your Irish whiskeys, things like that. They can be aged in barrels too, but not necessarily the same way that bourbon is. So it's just